Welcome to the closing lecture of the year, product of the collaboration between the Japan House São Paulo and the School of International Relations at Fundação Getulio Vargas. This round of events bring together researchers from Japan and from Brazil to discuss some of the most relevant issues on contemporary international affairs. My name is Luana Geiger, and I'll be tonight's event host. We are welcoming back Professor Dr. Carolina Moehlecke and Professor Dr. Yuka Fukunaga to present and debate on economic perspectives involving Brazil and the Asia-Pacific region. Once again, we highlight that all statements expressed during this event represent only personal opinions and not necessarily the institutional position of Fundação Getulio Vargas. Also, all present here have agreed to participate and have consented to be recorded on this broadcast, which will be later posted on FGV's official channels. The audience is encouraged to participate by sending questions during the event through the Slido platform. It can be accessed in the event description on YouTube. This event, we are swapping roles. So our main lecturer will be Professor Dr. Carolina Moehlecke, professor at the School of International Relations at Fundação Getulio Vargas in São Paulo. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of Texas at Austin, with emphasis in international relations and in methodology. Professor Moehlecke also holds a master's degree in political science from the same university and a bachelor's degree in international relations with distinction from Centro Universitário La Salle, which included an academic exchange period in Argentina. She has also been awarded the Best Dissertation Award by the International Collaboration Section of the American Political Science Association in 2019. Professor Moehlecke, it is a pleasure to host you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Luana, for this kind presentation, for this kind introduction. And I would like to thank the FGV School of International Relations and Japan House São Paulo for the opportunity of being here today, debating again these topics regarding the global economy that bring together Brazil, Japan, and the Asia-Pacific region. I'd like to also thank you, those in the audience and those who will be watching this later. So today, my talk will cover some general aspects pertaining the role and the position of Brazil in the contemporary global economy, with a focus towards challenges and opportunities concerning the Asia-Pacific and the structure of contemporary international politics. I will also point to some relevant aspects pertaining the relation with Japan, which holds an important trade investment relationship with Brazil as well. And I've tried to organize the lecture in such a way that it draws from aspects brought by Professor Yuka Fukunaga last week. So those of you who were able to watch her very interesting talk last week could also see some of the connections and hopefully continue our conversation. So here's a roadmap for this evening. I'll first give an overview of Brazil's role in the global trade, investment, and global value chains landscape. Then I'll talk about the Brazilian economic diplomacy and politics regarding trade and more focused on investment. And then I'll be discussing some of the challenges and opportunities that bring Brazil and the Asia-Pacific region together in economic terms. And then we'll have some time for conclusions and just some ideas to keep this interesting research agenda and analysis agenda ahead. All right, so to start, right, when we look at Brazil in the global trade landscape, we see that Brazil's participation in global trade is relatively modest. So Brazil is responsible for 1.2% of the world's total exports and just 0.9% of the world's total imports. That puts Brazil around the 26th position in the global ranking of share in the global trade. given Brazil's the size of the Brazilian economy as a whole, that's a modest participation. So Brazil today has a smaller participation in world trade relative to other developing economies like Mexico, Russia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the exports are mostly driven by agricultural products, though manufacturers do play a role. People usually hear about Brazil's role in exporting soy, in meat, and other commodities, but manufacturers are also important, and especially when it comes to regional trade. So Brazil is an important exporter of manufacturers to its neighbors in South America, and that holds an important place in domestic politics when it comes to the role that the export of those manufacturers play in the domestic economy, the domestic industry mostly. Imports are overwhelmingly driven by manufacturers. Brazil is highly dependent on imports of products that are not produced domestically. And in terms of partners, the main export destination these days is China. It's about a third of the exports of Brazil go to China, followed by the European Union and the United States. And when we look at the import origins, the same big trade partners comprise the main import origins of Brazilian imports. Japan stands out as an important trade partner for Brazil. It's among the top trade partners, both in terms of exports and imports. And there are some important products that make up for this relationship in terms of electronic circuits and other key parts for industry. And when we look at the composition of the trade partners of Brazil, we can see how dependent Brazil is of China and of the United States in a world of political tensions among these two great powers. And even though exports do play a disproportionate role, Chinese exports to China do play a disproportionate role in Brazil's trade profile, the fact that Brazil is also very dependent on imports from China and the United States is telling and is important in a world where countries can increasingly leverage trade as a geopolitical tool as well. So usually when we look at debates in the media and in other outlets, it's usual to point out let's look at China as we are dependent of China because it's an important consumer market for Brazil. And that's true. But we also need to pay attention to the other side of this coin, which is reliance on important imports that Brazil doesn't produce domestically. When we look at Brazil in the global investment landscape, the picture is a little bit different. Brazil's role as a recipient of foreign direct investment, FDI, is relatively stronger when we compare to Brazil's role in the global trade landscape. Brazil is the 6th largest recipient of foreign direct investment in the world. It has experienced, like many other countries during the pandemic, a retreat in inward foreign direct investment. This year, or in the last report by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Brazil stood out as receiving 2.5% of the world's inward foreign direct investment. And that's an important drop relative to 2019, which used to be 4.2. But again, it's important to note that this is a consequence of the pandemic that slowed down dynamics of investment around the world. It was a trend that it had already begun before the pandemic. The UNCTAD was already pointing out that investment flows were getting slower around the world, and the pandemic definitely accelerated that. Brazil is an economy that is, in terms of investment here, is very much driven by investment in services, also in industry, and a small role for agriculture. And the main origins of FDI to Brazil are from the United States, Luxembourg, and Netherlands. And you notice I added an asterisk here because when we talk about origins of foreign direct investment, it gets a little tricky because of the structure of ownership of multinational corporations. Many multinational corporations establish subsidiaries in territories where they can leverage the tax structure of different territories. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the companies are from these countries, but this is how it gets recorded. And this has some political implications as well. Japan has an important role in terms of origin for FDI in Brazil. It represents about 2% of the share. And it might seem like a small number, but that's far from negligible, because if we look here, the third main origin of FDI that comes into Brazil is from the Netherlands, and that's 8%. And the Netherlands is usually an origin that stands out because of this attractiveness because of taxes. So the FDI that comes from Japan into Brazil is really meaningful and relevant for the structure of the Brazilian economy. So when we look Brazil in the global investment landscape, it usually stands out. Like I said, the flows have slowed down around the world, and it remains to be seen how these flows, or whether they will recover as the world recovers from the pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty is certainly not very good for businesses, and multinationals wait until they have a little bit of scenario ahead in making those changes. We also need to notice that the domestic political situation in Brazil and the economic outlook have contributed to the exit of some important multinationals from Brazil. So recently, Brazil has experienced an outflow of corporations just leaving the country, which has some important political and social implications, because these companies are usually located or concentrated in cities where they employ lots of people. So this is something that the country will face as a challenge. It also means some opportunities for other investments that might decide to fill in that gap. Now, just talking about a little global value chains, which was something we discussed briefly last week. And when we talk about global value chains, we have to have in mind how the global production is structured in the contemporary economy, right? Production at the global stage has been fragmented over the years. So these days we have a situation where production stages of a given good or service, starting from its development, going through its production itself, and reaching post-sale services, are all fragmented across multiple firms and multiple countries. And because of this fragmentation that allows for gains in terms of efficiency and contribute to development, global value chains are considered a tool for development, and they play an important role in making countries wealthier and more developed. Brazil has a limited role in global value chains. That's something that most analysts agree. This is partly due to both characteristics of the economy, but also an idea that all stages of production should be concentrated in Brazil. So when we talk, some groups, there's a perception among influential sectors that the country will be missing something unless everything is made domestically. This is somewhat flawed reasoning, because it's unlikely that one single country can specialize to the point of supplying all of its needs domestically, especially in a world where many products depend on a lot of components, on a lot of technology. So mostly Brazil has been placed in global value chains in a very limited fashion. An important share of the foreign direct investment that enters in Brazil is to supply the local market directly and not so much to integrate it into the global economy, which means limited opportunities for innovation and for fostering economic complexity. And economic complexity is something that it's worth spending a couple of minutes discussing, because an influential strand of research these days looks at economic complexity as a key driver of a country's development. So there's this economic complexity index, which is a measure of an economy's capacity to that can be inferred from data that connects locations to the activities that are present in that location. And it's very interesting to look that Japan ranks first in the economic complexity ranking. This is an effort made by researchers at the MIT. So Japan ranks first in that economic complexity ranking, and Brazil is number 49. So very far apart. And that is very telling of how the extent to which these two economies are integrated or are not integrated in the global economy. And other Asia-Pacific economies play a very important role in that ranking too, like South Korea and Singapore. So if we look through the role of these countries in global value chains through another lens, which is as importers of intermediates, so importers of those products and services that serve as inputs for final products, Brazil also plays a very modest role, only less than 1.3% of the global share, where we see like the top importers of intermediates, China, United States, Germany, Japan, and South Korea, playing much more significant roles. And it's very interesting to look too that Brazil is behind countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, all very well integrated economies into global value chains. Economies that have been able to grow and develop because they fostered that integration with other economies and have diversified and inserted themselves into a more complex structure of their economy. Of course, there are vulnerabilities when it comes to being that integrated in the global economy. Those vulnerabilities were already showing before the pandemic. There were already discussions and debates about how one single industry in a country might have its activities interrupted because of the lack of a single component that comes from a very specific country and region, and how disruptive that can be, and how that can be sometimes leveraged for geopolitical reasons as well. The pandemic has certainly accelerated those concerns. But when it comes about assessing the relative costs and the relative benefits, there are sure opportunities for countries like Brazil to become more integrated, and while of course devising policies and keeping an eye on the potential vulnerabilities. Right? There's another interesting way to compare how Brazil and Asia-Pacific economies differ in terms of their integration into global value chains. That is to consider how much of a product produced domestically relies on foreign content. And in Brazil, you see some products having like 10% of foreign content embedded. And when we look in other countries like Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, this can reach even 70%. So that shows the level of integration, or the lack thereof in the case of Brazil, that puts these countries in different positions and roles in global value chains, which also is important in terms of politics. So after providing those introductory or this overview, right, about where Brazil stands in terms of its role in trade, investment, and global value chains, I think it's worth considering and talking a little bit about the economic diplomacy of the country, and also making a parallel to Professor Fukunaga's talk last week. It's interesting to see some of the commonalities and differences between Brazil and Japan diplomacy, our diplomatic approach to trade, investment, and its role in the economy. So historically, like Japan, Brazil is a strong supporter of multilateralism and of the rules-based system. It's often said that even in the World Trade Organization politics, Brazil punches above its weight. It has a very important role and a tradition of being very vocal and being very engaged at the WTO. This is partly due to the very capable diplomatic body, the very capable Brazilian diplomatic body, which is very well qualified and specialized. And Brazil has developed a tradition and an expertise of being able to defend its interests within the WTO. So Brazil is the seventh main user of the dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO. That's the data. The data is from 2017, but I suppose it hasn't changed that dramatically since then. Is the fourth among complainants and the first among developing countries. So Brazil has filed 34 cases, has responded to another 17, and has been a third party in over 100 cases within the WTO. And Brazil has historically exerted leadership and has been able to form important developing country coalitions within the WTO. And that's why some people say it punches above its weight, because it has developed these capabilities even before China, which is like a trade giant, definitely. There have been some historical wins against developed countries, most notably against the United States in the cotton and the steel cases. And the country has led an activist position in former negotiations, such as the Doha round. So when we look at the WTO these days, within the crisis of the multilateralism and the tensions around the rules-based system, Brazil stands to lose from these tensions, because it has developed a capacity to take advantage of the WTO to foster its interests and to play ahead its interests. So when we look at the tensions we have around multilateralism, Brazil certainly loses an opportunity to make its voice and its interests heard. Of course, Brazil does not restrict its economic diplomacy to the multilateral setting. When we look in terms of trade agreements outside the multilateral scope, we have a picture that shows that the Brazilian economic diplomacy in trade is strongly attached to Mercosur. So Mercosur was celebrated in the early 90s between Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And as part of that celebration, of celebrating that agreement, the countries established the basis for a common market. And currently, Mercosur is a customs union, which means that there is free intra-zone trade and a common trade policy with a common external tariff between the member countries. which means that countries can negotiate trade agreements independently with other countries, as long as this doesn't mean the implementation of differentiated tariffs from the bloc. So, for instance, Brazil has celebrated an agreement with Chile, but it mostly refers to rules regarding e-commerce and regulatory practices. It cannot offer a differentiated tariff to Chile rather than to the members of Mercosur. And we see that the structure of the Mercosur and how it shapes trade policy in Brazil, it's reflected in terms of the agreements that it has in force. It's mostly with the region, other regional partners in South America, with a few exceptions like Egypt, India, Israel, and the Southern African Customs Union, which is a more also recent partnership. Then when we look at concluded trade agreements, so these are agreements that the negotiations have been concluded. Now they wait for ratification and implementation. We see a different move, right? We see in a concluded trade agreement with EFTA, which is the organization comprised by Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, Palestine, and the European Union. Definitely the agreement, the Mercosur EU trade deal, is the one that makes the headlines these days, is the most high profile trade deal that makes for the debate and the news these days. It could be, once it's implemented, it could really have the potential to unlock important flows, important trade flows between the two blocs. But it's also a very contentious trade agreement in terms of the politics of it. It has, as Dr. Fukunaga mentioned very clearly in her talk last week, trade is not just about trade anymore, right? We have issues like environmental protection, human rights, social and labor protection. And this deal between Mercosur and the European Union should face a very difficult road ahead in the process of ratification because of these non-trade issues. So the European Union has been pressuring, especially Brazil, concerning its environmental policies, that it has to show a credible commitment to end deforestation and fires in the Amazon. Otherwise, the deal won't be ratified. France has been probably the most vocal about it. Of course, there are protectionist pressures playing a role behind these discussions. But we also know from research that there are true fair traders among the populations. There are segments of the population that truly put environmental concerns above protectionist concerns. And we know that the influence of the public opinion in these kinds of issues might be consequential. So definitely one development to watch how the Mercosur European Union trade deal will play out. And more recently, we have witnessed Brazil also putting other trade agreements under discussion. So talks with Canada, South Korea, Indonesia, Lebanon, Singapore, and Vietnam. These talks are in different stages of development. Some of them are very early, others are more advanced, but it reflects the regions and Brazil's attempts to diversify its trade partners and move beyond an exclusive regional focus. And we also note the relevance of the Asia-Pacific region here in this new phase of potential trade agreements in the future. This is very much in line with the current position of the Brazilian Ministry of Economy that has laid out a trade policy strategy based on 3 pillars. So basically, reduction of non-tariff barriers, those sanitary measures that might be put as barriers to trade, the modernization of the Mercosur's tariff structure, so very much in line with how the trade policy in Brazil is usually shaped, and the expansion of trade agreements. So we clearly see an evolution or a development from the enforced trade agreements very much focused on the region. And like I mentioned earlier in the talk, the region plays a very important role in the Brazilian economy because it's the main destination of exports of manufacturers. But then moving towards a more a broader approach in terms of regions, right? Seeking partnerships with Europe and the Asia-Pacific as well. When we look to Brazil's economic diplomacy and investment, we also have a very interesting singular case. Brazil is one of the few countries that has never ratified a bilateral investment agreement containing an investor-state dispute settlement clause. This means that for investors, they cannot bring claims against Brazil directly in international courts. This is very different from the structure of different countries. Japan has ratified several of these agreements containing investor-state dispute settlement clauses, and many other countries, most countries in the world. But Brazil instead has moved towards the signature of agreements on the facilitation of investment. And those are mostly focused on creating different institutions and even more informal rules, if you will, that will make investment more transparent and facilitate those ties. The dispute settlement mechanism that is preferred by Brazil is one between states. So there's no way that a multinational corporation can sue Brazil directly like it can do in other countries. Brazil currently has only 2 of those agreements in force with Angola and Mexico, but it has been negotiating many more. And more importantly, Brazil has been a very active voice in the multilateral setting that is discussing the reform of the international investment law system. So currently there have been a lot of talks and working groups within the UNCITRAL and UNCTAD, which are the organizations that lead the policy and the recommendations in terms of investment in the world. And Brazil has been trying to advance this model of agreements on the facilitation of investment to substitute the older bilateral investment treaties that are the standard in the world. This is in a context where investor-state dispute settlement is under scrutiny. Lots of countries have been facing backlash because of being part of that system, including developed countries. So Europe has been a very leading voice in trying to find solutions to reform the system. So it's a very singular role that Brazil plays in this economic diplomacy, and one sometimes that flies under the radar. But I think it's interesting that we have the space to discuss this as well. Brazil has also been focusing its economic diplomacy in other initiatives. So it has been signing some memorandums of cooperation or of understanding that are more restricted in scope and in also regarding the level of the commitment itself. It's not like a preferential trade agreement or an investment agreement. These are memorandums of cooperation and understanding. So there have been attempts, or there has been one that has been signed with Japan, and another one for China, that declares the intents of these countries to strengthen their ties in terms of investment for infrastructure, energy, communications, technology, And I think this relates to another point that Professor Fukunaga made last week about how countries can look for even more informal partnerships or not so strict and traditional agreements like the usual preferential trade agreements or bilateral investment treaties we know. So these are movements that Brazil has been trying to make in order to foster ties with strategic partners that have become even more important. And when we look at the broader picture, I think as we move towards the end, it's perhaps useful to look from a broader perspective in terms of the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead Brazil and the Asia-Pacific. So in this world of multilateralism in crisis, the expansion of the mega trade deals that are actually so much more about trade, as they also cover all those environmental, social rules and human rights. I think the question we make is Brazil more vulnerable, or can it find opportunities? And like we saw, Brazil is heavily dependent in terms of trade on both China and the United States, and we have all been witnessing the political tensions between these two great powers. Regarding China, there's a lot of dependence on the export side, with the Chinese being key consumer market for commodities, but also from the import side because of the relevant trading intermediates coming from this country, and the same applies to the US. So Brazil has a very tricky challenge ahead of trying to balance its interests between China and the United States. It's dependent on these two countries, both from the export and the import sides. And Brazil should benefit from a reduction of tensions between these two, but we do not see strong indications that we will have those, at least not meaningfully so, anytime soon. So Brazil needs to be very skilled and move carefully in order to cater to both of these important trade partners. And because of that, because of this complicated scenario, it's also in Brazil's interest to diversify its trade partners and strengthening both its export and import relations with countries in other regions, such as the Asia-Pacific. And when we look at the Brazilian government's statements regarding the mega trade deals involving the Asia-Pacific region, like the CPTPP and the RCEP, we see that the country is attentive to these dynamics. So Brazil sees the Asia-Pacific region as one of the most dynamic regions in the globe, precisely because of the movements of those two mega trade deals. And if we look at the latest statements by the Secretary of Trade, it's clear that the country is paying attention to those dynamics and seeing a lot of opportunities. Related to that, another dimension that has been gaining a lot of attention in the country is to revise the rule of the Mercosur that does not allow member countries to make independent negotiations for new trade deals. So there's an understanding, and that is shared by Uruguay too, that the countries in Mercosur should have some leeway to negotiate different independent trade deals. And some of those early talks that Brazil has been having with countries in the Asia-Pacific region are related to that effort, to that larger effort of maybe in the future building this possibility of negotiating independent trade deals and better integrating Brazil in the global economy. Of course, this is all very incipient, and it'll be a very difficult political situation, because Mercosur plays a very important role for the domestic industry in Brazil, but there is this tension with how Brazil can deal with the structure of the institution to allow for more integration and diversification of trade partners in a world where tensions are building up. So to conclude, I'll just briefly summarize some of the main points. Brazil does play a modest role in global trade and in global value chains. It plays a slightly stronger role in global investment, but still to focus on production for the domestic market. It is historically a strong supporter of multilateralism, of the rules-based system. It plays an important role at the WTO, which means that the transformations pertaining the organization, politics of the organization, are something that needs to be watched. Brazil's insertion in trade agreements is strongly shaped by Mercosur dynamics. The country has been increasingly working to find alternatives and to find for strategic partnerships in the Asia-Pacific. So it makes sense to look at how Brazil and the Asia-Pacific countries move in this new structure of the global economy, because there will be more events happening pertaining to this too. Brazil also has this very singular participation in international investment law, notably different from most countries, and a position that has been aligned with at least part of the talks for the reform of the system. And Brazil looks at the deals that, like the CPTPP and the RCEP as potential opportunities. But to make the most out of these opportunities, it also has to pay attention to the non-economic issues pertaining trade and investment. So it's environmental policy, it's human rights policy. These are not detached from how it will move towards this new dynamics of the global trade and investment. So certainly lots of interesting topics to follow ahead. So I'll stop now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Moehlecke, for this insightful presentation. As we proceed to the discussions, I introduce our commentator, Professor Dr. Fukunaga, Professor of the School of Social Sciences at Waseda University. She is a Doctor of Laws from the University of Tokyo and a Master of Laws from the same university, and also from the University of California. She received her Bachelor of Laws from Hitotsubashi University. She has been a government appointment collaborator to the International Law Commission in Geneva, a lecturer of the WTO capacity building seminars, as well as a visiting fellow at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies and in Georgetown University. She has received the Waseda Research Award in 2017. Professor Fukunaga, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to Professor Moehlecke for your very informative and also insightful lecture. I think I'm going to make comments on probably two points. One is about global value chains, and the other is investment facilitation. But probably because of the time limit, I'm going to make comments mostly about the global value chains. So I'm very glad, actually, that you raised this issue of global value chains, because I didn't really mention about this issue in my last week's lecture, but it's very important, and we should discuss this matter. And to build resilient global value chains is and should be one of the most important objectives in the future cooperation between Japan and Brazil, and more broadly in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think the importance of this issue has been painfully illustrated by the ongoing pandemic. And during the pandemic, the shortage of products started with masks and gloves and other personal protective equipment, PPE, and then expanded to cover various products such as toilet papers and vaccines. And currently, the semiconductor shortage is causing serious difficulties in many industries in many countries. And of course, not all these shortages were rooted in uncertainties of the global value chains, but the pandemic highlighted the vulnerability of the global value chains. And Professor Moehlecke mentioned that the global value chains have a fragmented structure. And I think the fragmented structure of the global value chains inherently have weaknesses inside. And you also mentioned the U.S.-China tensions, and that adds more uncertainties to the global value chains. And but this issue or this objective of building resilient global value chains had been one of Japan's most important policy objectives, even before the pandemic started. And particularly Japan's dependence on natural resources from China has always been a concern. And this concern actually became a reality in 2010 when China imposed restrictions on the export of rare earths, when the tension between these two countries escalated due to a certain accident in the sea. And since then, Japan has been taking various policies to diversify, as you mentioned, the sources of the rare earths, and successfully so. And now the dependence rate of rare earths on China is reduced to 60%, but still high. So there is always a risk that the supply of these rare metals may be cut. And so my questions to you are related to these global value chains risks. The first question would be related to Japan-Brazil relationship. And how can we cooperate in building resilient global value chains? And you mentioned, Professor Moehlecke mentioned the memorandum between Japan and Brazil, but as you mentioned, it's really limited in scope. But to further develop the cooperation between our countries, how can we do that? And actually, in my last week's lecture, I suggested that legally binding agreements may have become a little bit outdated, and more informal instruments could be used. But at the same time, as I mentioned, Brazil is exploring possibilities of concluding more legally binding agreements with other countries. And Japan probably still has strong interest in expanding its FTA network with other countries, including Brazil. Against that kind of background, should Japan and Brazil seek the possibility of a legally binding FTA, or should we try to deepen our cooperation based on non-legal informal instruments? And so that's kind of one point related to the global value chains. And in relation to that, you also mentioned during your lecture the importance of human rights issues and environmental concerns, and you also mentioned the deforestation matter, which was heavily criticized by European countries like France. And so that also is important in constructing the global value chains. And global value chains are not just about securing the supply of certain materials, but the global value chains have to be sustainable from various perspectives, have to be sustainable from an environmental perspective, have to be sustainable from a human rights perspective. And in fact, the Japanese industries are currently reviewing their global value chains to make sure that there aren't any human rights violations, or there aren't any environmental damages in their global value chains. So what would be the Brazilian government or the Brazilian industry's views on this kind of a sustainability aspect of the global value chains? And also my kind of last point, my last point related to global value chains may not be really, may not interest you, so you can just skip it. But what I'm kind of considering is that in order to build the resilient global value chains, the government has to intervene through government funding. Actually, many governments in many countries have been providing extensive amount of subsidies to those industries. And it's really essential for the governments, and it's legitimate for the governments to support their industries through financial support. But at the same time, those financial supports could result in a trade distortion. And, there's an agreement in the WTO on subsidies. And to some extent, trade distorted subsidies are regulated by the subsidies agreement in the WTO. And Japan, the US, and the EU are saying that the subsidies regulations in the WTO are not stringent enough, and we have to strengthen the subsidies regulations to avoid subsidies causing trade distortive effect. So there is a need to balance, to sort of reconcile the need to build global value chains through government support, but with the need to avoid the trade distortive effects of the subsidies. How can we do that? That is kind of my sort of more personal interest. And if I may briefly touch upon my second point related to investment facilitation, I think it's really interesting, as I mentioned, that Brazil is taking a very different, unique position on this matter, and Brazil has not accepted any, as long as I understand, Brazil has not accepted any FTAs with ISDS. But that position is unique in a way, but at the same time, now many countries, more and more countries, are expressing skepticism against the ISDS. So in a way, the concern of those countries resonate with Brazil's approach to the ISDS, and those countries, and that concern may not be shared by the Japanese government or the Japanese industry, but there is a concern shared by many countries, and those countries are exploring alternative approaches. And one of the alternatives is investment facilitation, as you said. And I really think it's really important alternative. It could be a very effective alternative. And as you said, there are negotiations going on in the WTO context. And last week, WTO, I forgot, 67 WTO members concluded negotiations on domestic regulations on trade and services. And there are, I think, overlaps between those domestic regulations negotiations and the investment facilitation negotiations. So if you have a view on how the domestic regulations negotiations and commitments could impact on the investment facilitation talks, and how the investment facilitation talks could be concluded. I think there are two questions related to the investment facilitation talks. One is about the substance of talks. What obligation, what commitments those WTO members will make. And the other question is, what form the final result will be? Should the final result be a legally binding agreement, or will the final result be more informal instruments? That is my second point related to investment facilitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fukunaga, for this very, very interesting, insightful comment. I think there's a lot of rich, interesting, thought-provoking topics that I would love to have many hours to keep discussing them with you. But I think very briefly concerning the point of building resilient global value chains, I completely agree that this is the top priority in terms of fostering development, especially in countries that are still lagging behind in those terms. But it's a big challenge, definitely, because it requires, like you said, the participation of the state. It requires the involvement of the private sector. It requires an institutional framework that is, I believe, somewhere in between more formal commitments and more informal ones. And I think it's interesting that you brought the topic of Japan reducing its reliance on the rare earth minerals from China, because that was a very successful policy in terms of building a resilient global value chain, or reducing that dependence on China. And that indicates that sourcing the inputs that domestic and global industries need it's not just a matter of finding the cheapest or the best source in terms of the characteristics of the good, but finding sources that are reliable. And that entails building political relations that are based on trust, and that rely on a very big diplomatic effort. So I see that there are layers of interactions in countries as we move towards this path of building a resilient global value chain. So it requires a lot of coordination with many different actors, and especially when we add those other issues like environmental protection and human rights. These are demands from consumers. These are demands from investors. These are demands of some governments. And it's unlikely that any country in the world will be able to build resilient global value chains without paying attention to those aspects. I think in Brazil specifically, replying to your very interesting question, there are some tensions that need to be resolved, because on one hand, there's an understanding that Brazil needs to would benefit from being more connected into global value chains and building resilient relationships with strategic partners. But at the same time, there's still a concern that when it comes to these other issues like environmental protection and human rights, that will be some sort of threat to sovereignty. And how you reconcile those, it's difficult in the current political climate. But I don't see any other way. I don't see any way other than finding a balance between these interests. And I think very, very briefly too, because I'm aware we're running out of time, but the issue of how we reconcile the need for subsidies and how we or the government intervention in building those global value chains, and how we reconcile that with rules within the WTO and other commitments that countries have, really highlight your point that some of those agreements will probably take a more informal shape. Not abandoning the formal regular agreements, but we're probably moving towards a world where the commitments really take that spaghetti bowl shape, and they overlap, and they require a lot of coordination. The same regarding with investment facilitation and domestic regulations negotiations. One of the main criticisms towards investor-state dispute settlement is precisely that it restricts the policy space of the signatory countries that see the need of enacting some domestic regulations that allow them to perform the role they want to perform in the global economy. So I think it will be increasingly difficult to look at those topics separately, as they are all related together. And I'm sure we would have much more to talk if we continue here, but I'll stop because of the time. But thank you very much. It was very interesting, and it was great to be here with you tonight discussing these topics.
Thank you so much to both professors for this opportunity of exchange. We have received many questions from the audience, and I have merged some of them into a couple of questions. And the first one asks, what do you think, Professor Moehlecke, are Brazil's main challenges when considering the possibility of a greater integration into global value chains? And also, what are the main challenges and opportunities for an agreement between Brazil and Japan through formal or informal instruments? I'm going to send you the written questions so you can have a look.
Thank you, Luana, and thank you, the audience, for the questions. So in terms of challenges when considering the possibility of greater integration into global value chains, I think the challenges refer, I wouldn't say mainly, but very heavily on the tensions around the need of reconciling the non-economic aspects with the economic aspects, so that Brazil really embeds the commitment with environmental protection and human rights protection, and understands that these are inherent and necessary to a better integration with the global economy. Like we were just discussing, these demands, they are not imposed by some sort of outside structure or anything of the kind. I mean, these are demands that come from consumers. These are demands that come from financial investors. These are demands that come from other governments with whom Brazil keeps diplomatic relationships. So the challenge of pointing both the public sector with the private sector towards the right direction, and understanding that we cannot disassociate those topics is definitely a challenge. There are other challenges that are more related to the structure of the Brazilian economy, of improving infrastructure, of improving the qualification of the workforce. These are other issues that are very also difficult to solve, but that would also benefit from further integration. And when it comes from the challenges and opportunities for an agreement between Brazil and Japan through both informal and formal instruments, well, Brazil and Japan certainly have a lot of opportunities to build greater ties in terms of trade investment. These are economies that have complementary advantages, so they could explore those complementary these complementary advantages. Brazil could definitely take the opportunity of strengthening its political and economic environment as a host to Japanese corporations that are extremely important in the global economy and are generators of jobs and taxes and technology. And Japan could find in Brazil a reliable partner to keep sourcing for inputs and needs that it also seeks to develop. So yeah, I think these are the main points.
Thank you, Professor. I'll take just one last question. In your opinion, in the scenario of increasing competition between the US and China, should Brazil focus on diversifying its trade partners through a multilateral framework? Or do you think the country should define priorities and rules regarding the entry of capital from bilateral partners in order to facilitate the intra-industry trade? I'm also going to send you the question on our chat.
Thank you. So yes, the increasing competition between US and China is indeed a challenge for Brazil, and it has been noted by the authorities, by the diplomatic body. Diversifying its trade partners, it's an interesting strategy. Perhaps the multilateral setting is, like we mentioned, it has been facing some challenges. It's in a bumpy road, but Brazil has been actively trying to diversify those partners through even more bilateral settings, and that could be interesting. It's very hard for a country to define priorities and rules in a world of uncertainty and where the power structure is shifting. But Brazil can be strategic. I don't think it's not so much about defining priorities, but being strategic and exploring the best opportunities. Brazil has a historical tradition of keeping good relations with all the countries in the world, and you should take an advantage of reviving that tradition and really finding the strategic partners that it needs to grow and develop. Thank you.
As we approach the end of the lecture, we would like to thank once again both professors, our audience, and the Japan House São Paulo for supporting the event. Next event will take place in February 2022. Thank you very much and have a great night.